Just Share is a non-profit shareholder activism organization. We believe that the private sector has a crucial role to play in building a more inclusive and sustainable society in South Africa. Over the last few years, we have been quite amazed at the extent to which it seems that misconceptions about the drivers of inequality form the basis of corporate positions on disclosure, particularly, and inequality-related policy making. So Just Share really wanted to gather together the people who know more than anyone else in the country what this evidence is of the foundations and drivers of inequality. And the purpose of today's discussion is to provide a platform for deep reflection on why there appears to be this disconnect between what poverty and inequality research tells us and what the prevailing public views on inequality and poverty are.
My name is Isabel Fry. I am the executive and founding director of a feminist think tank known as the Social Policy Initiative based in Joburg.
My name is Neil Coleman. I'm co-founder and senior policy specialist at the Institute for Economic Justice. South Africa is really a prisoner to outdated economic paradigms and our legacy of structural economic exclusion. Many of the economic policy choices made in the last 28 years have had devastating impacts, which the majority are feeling to this day. And our assumption is that it doesn't have to be this way.
My name is Rachel Bukasa. I'm the director of Black Sash. Black Sash is a veteran human rights organization operating for the last 67 years.
I'm Murray Leibrand. I'm the director of the Southern Africa Labour and Development Research Unit at the University of Cape Town, a unit that's been around for close to 50 years, actually, and has always directed itself at producing evidence and analysis of how South Africa actually works. South Africa, as we all know, has off-the-charts inequality. What that really means is if you look at our society, it's a very stifled society where we're performing far worse than we could, far below our potential. We're not leveraging the agency of people to do better themselves.
My name is Masana Mulaudzi. I'm the programs director at Sonke Gender Justice. I'm an economist working on gender-based violence, and I've been entering this work really as supporting feminist movements in articulating their agenda around what feminist economics can look like in theory and in practice.
I'm from Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, which is kind of a think tank that does work on industrial policy, the role of large companies, like the ones that are listed on the stock exchange, where you can do shareholder activism. They have a profound impact, not just on workplace inequality, but even more on who has access to employment, who has access to production and to ownership and control and power. You know, we have a problem in South Africa, which is that we have very concentrated ownership in the economy, a very concentrated power in the economy, and yet we have a true democratic state where we say that everybody has a vote. So it's particularly important to think about how do we engage with big business.
Some of you may be aware that the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition last year put out for public comment an amendment to the Companies Act proposing, amongst other things, that there be public disclosure by listed companies of their vertical wage gaps, their gender wage gaps, their race wage gaps, the differentials between the highest earners and the lowest earners, etc. Predictably, there was a big backlash from the corporate sector on this. And the BLSA, an extract from the BLSA statement says, we believe this income disclosure requirement will do little to address inequality in South Africa, which is driven primarily by unemployment rather than income disparity of the employed. We then have Stats SA, which says that the largest contributor to overall income inequality is from the labor market at 74.2%, and that labor market income is overwhelmingly the largest contributor to income inequality when compared to other sources. So what I would like our panelists to discuss is, what does labor market inequality mean? And is it true that our high levels of unemployment mean that there is no point, nothing to be gained from focusing on internal inequality dynamics within corporations, within the corporate sector itself?
Normally, when we talk about labor market inequality, we're actually talking about wages. Mm-hmm. and not unemployment. So because people who are unemployed are outside the labor market in any case. Having said that, it is a valid question to say, what is the impact of wage inequality in South Africa compared to the impact of employment on incomes? And doing a very, very simple back of the envelope model, I have to say that because we have some of the deepest inequalities from earned income in the world, probably despite our unusually high rate of unemployment, that actually has a bigger impact on household inequality than unemployment does. South Africa has a bigger share of people who are considered working poor. That is, they earn less than the equivalent of $1.90 a day. That's the international poverty line. And what's worse is that it's actually gone down more slowly here than in other countries in the last 10 years. This is why those disclosure requirements are so important. We don't know enough about what's going on inside big companies and how that shapes inequality. So that issue of what does the work organization do to suppress pay? And how does that affect inequality is quite critical within these big companies. And as a first step, we need greater clarity about what they're paying and how they're paying, but we need to see the link that it's not just historically oppressive pay scales and underpaying people at the lower end and systematically undervaluing their work, but it's also that their work has been de-skilled to the point to justify paying more for people with qualifications.
The labor market does sit at the center of South Africa's world-beatingly high income inequality. And in a sense, that's almost an obvious statement, because whilst inequality is a complicated thing and reproduced by many, like inequalities in education and in health and in, where you live spatially, that all feeds into the labor market in terms of generating income and positioning you in the income distribution, both in terms of whether you get access to a job and what sort of quality of employment that you have. And so that's why the labor market, in the formal analyses that we do of income inequality, it's well over 3/4 of the total contribution to income inequality in the country. And what's interesting about that is when you push that a bit further and break that up into, okay, how much of that is due to the fact that such a large percentage of the workforce in South Africa doesn't have a job, and then how much of it is due to the inequalities within the employed, the wage inequality that we have in the country. Those sorts of analyses show that those are both crucial issues. So it's really not useful for anybody to categorize the labor market inequality situation in South Africa as one that's only about unemployment. And to all intents and purposes, that they are both absolutely crucial. Then when you get into you start moving up to the 4th, 5th, 6th deciles of the South African labor market. They're still very poor. Don't forget that 55% of South Africans fall below the poverty line. The wage inequality itself in South Africa is also world-beatingly high. It's not right to conceptualize the issue as employment creation only. We do have to worry about how the whole labor market functions together.
Do you know which African country is number 5 in gender pay gap equality? African country, number 5 in the world, with your Icelands, your Norways. It's Rwanda. The reason they've been able to do that is because the scapegoating attitude that, oh no, it's not us, it's government's responsibility to do jobs, oh, it's not them. No, after the genocide, what they did was collectively make a concerted effort that everybody's going to come to the table and make this work. And one of the key things that was used was this transparency thing.
Let me just read you a tiny extract from a BLSA position statement. Even a modest basic income grant of 600 Rand a month would cost 300 billion Rand in new spending, rising to double that as the value of the grant increases. In fact, the right thing to do is the opposite, and you may have heard this before, focus on growing the economy. A growing economy creates employment and reduces poverty. It generates taxable revenue that fills the state's coffers and enables it to spend sustainably on social priorities. So, of course, that sounds very reasonable, right? It sounds, okay, most South Africans, especially those, who are sort of in the business world somewhere, would hear that and say, that sounds like a good idea, and I don't want to be taxed more to support a universal basic income grant. So, Neil, let me ask you, what is behind this position?
When business says we don't want a high minimum wage, we don't want a basic income, we don't want to raise the living standards of the working poor, they're also saying to people in those households, the unemployed, we don't want to either support you with basic income, nor do we want to raise wages. Remember, unemployment is a tax on the working poor. Who supports the unemployed? It's the working poor. If you look at the latest survey by the Peter Maritzburg Justice and Equity Group, basic food basket cost $2,300 in September this year. That was last month. The national minimum wage is around 4,100 rand. They calculate that transport and electricity costs on average 2,400 rand. So you subtract the 2,400 from the 4,100, and what do you have left? They calculate that workers' families will underspend on food, on just the absolute food essentials, by 1,600 rand every month. So even families with breadwinners earning the national minimum wage live in food poverty. And these are the so-called elite that we're being told about. National minimum wage workers, these are the people who are fortunate to have jobs, we're being told by business. And this is compounded by the highest inequality on earth, as we've heard, the highest unemployment for a comparable country, over 12 million. So it's in this context that proposals for a universal basic income grant have been tabled. And the introduction of the social relief distress grant, the 350 grant, came in the context of a crisis where these social realities were stripped bare. Everyone became aware of the extent of hunger and destitution in our society. But now what do National Treasury and the sections of business want? They want to terminate this social relief of distress grant. They're opposed to a basic income grant. They'll argue that even a very small outlay expenditure of about 50 billion rand, which is what it costs to extend the social relief of distress grant, that is less than 2.5% of our budget, less than 2.5% of our budget, which at the peak of the SRD grant was supporting 11 million individuals. And if you take that they have 2 dependents each, that means that over half the population, over 30 million people, were being supported in some way or another by the SRD grant. Now, they're saying South Africa cannot afford 2.5% of the budget or less to support half the population, which is, outrageous. Now, the work that Murray and others have done shows that the SRD grant have played an important role in combating destitution and the worst forms of hunger. So what are they ignoring? They're ignoring the economics and social costs of not acting. Saying that we're going to wait for growth, we're going to wait for structural reforms. But the economic and social costs of not doing anything, what was the cost of July 2021? The latest estimates are that it cost the economy over 100 billion rand, more than double what it costs to extend the social relief of distress grant. What are the positive things that they're ignoring? They're ignoring the dynamic economic impacts of injecting these resources into economically depressed communities. Finally, this discussion is not just about economic development. It's also about social cohesion. It's about gender equity. So a basic income is not a silver bullet. We're not saying it'll solve all society's problems, but why it's very important, all the economic reconstruction program proposals are going to take years to roll out. The COVID grant, you roll it out, 350 rand is in that beneficiary's hand in the month. The impact is immediate. It's high impact and quick to roll out.
The critical question is, where do you get your livelihoods for survival? And is that going to be to make you basically just surviving, or is it about making you thriving and an agent of your own life? That has a racialized history in South Africa, and people were intended to be servants, and that's it. In 5 of the 9 provinces, the greatest source of income is from grants. So from a social security policy perspective, you've got to ask, what is the aim behind this transfer of money? So you can look at it a couple of ways. There's the human rights way, which business doesn't really kind of care that much for. So the human rights way says, people deserve to live with dignity. That's a universal, fundamental human right. But then you also have the economic argument. And again, many of my learned colleagues have spoken about that. For an economy to run, there needs to be a flow of money. To generate demand, you need to have people who have disposable income to do so. So the first income decile, so that's when income is divided into 10. So the first one, the monthly income is 65 Rand. The second one is 394 Rand per month. The third one is 725. So you're seeing that this is incredibly, this is unlivable. The fourth income decile, the 40% of people in South Africa are receiving 1,082 Rand or less. The fifth one, 1,500. So 50, like half of the population income deciles, 1.5 per month. Sixth income, 2.1 per month. Seventh income is 3,000 per month. The eighth income jumps up to 4,000. So 70% of the people in this country, 4,000, which is 5,000. And then the leap, so the ninth income decile is 9,000. And then the 10th income is 25,000. So there is a leap between the 9th and the 10th income decile from 9,000 per month to 25,000. That is unbelievable. And that means that there is a massing and sort of aggregation of income amongst 10% of the population. You can't spend it as much as 90% would be able to.
As a national minimum wage commissioner like Neva, I think what astounds me, trying to put this politely, how keen the business sector is when it comes to the annual negotiation for the increase of the national minimum wage to start with a zero increase. So basically, despite the fact that a zero increase means that the value of the wage drops, the business sector says we can't afford to increase the national minimum wage. So the victory that we had after 3 years of negotiating in NEDLAC for this national minimum wage, the dissatisfaction over the amount of it because it wasn't anywhere near to a living wage, there is still a constant attack by the corporate sector. The corporate sector does not sleep. It is always vigilant in its attempt to reduce this. There's a very short-term approach from the corporate sector, which is to extract the maximum amount of profits without a thought about the sustainability. And I often think that Marikana, to an extent, was about that, because a rock driller was never going to become the manager of Lonmin. A rock driller was going to end their career as a rock driller. So you had to fight for a higher wage. So if we could shift that sort of thinking and say, rather than seeing how do I maximize my profits by sort of lowering my cost of labor for this year, it's about how can we ensure that over the next 5 to 15 years, we have a sustainable growth, which ultimately will extend the profits. And I think to a large extent, it's about the financialization of our economy, the fact that shareholders have very little link to the company that they have invested in, and the intermediaries, which are fund managers.
I think the line, I've worked this hard, other people should work hard as well. We hear it particularly in the conversation around grants as well. And for me, what I cannot wrap my head around, because we need to be careful not to preach to the converted, is that the Black elites and the Black middle class buy into this narrative. We know where we came from. We know where our grandparents are. How are we getting into these corporate sectors and buying that argument against grants? There's a reason why the Black middle class does not go far financially as much as other races. The reason for that is that one salary is split between 15, 8, 10 people. And so for me, it's just calling out that the Black middle class, as well as the Black elite, we have to do so much better in just blindly buying this argument, because it helps us fit in our particular, circumstances.
The Companies Amendment Bill proposes specific information that should be disclosed. Are they being asked to disclose the right stuff? Is that going to help us? If not, what should we be getting from corporates?
We work extensively with corporates in South Africa. We work with listed companies, supporting them in thinking through what an anti-sexual harassment and safeguarding approach looks like, what it looks like for them to meaningfully address gender-based violence in South Africa, what it looks like for them to be better. So I think that is really important. What are some of the just even if it's the numbers, we don't have to know the details of the cases. What's your safeguarding approach and how are you implementing it in your strategic plan over the next 5 years? What is your demographics at all levels, not just in senior management at board level, but also, and here's the real ringer, what is your career pathing plan across all of these levels? Because that really allows us to get behind the masking that we see taking place in corporate South Africa.
I'm just going to read out the questions we've asked for the next two panels. Why do such significant gender wage gaps persist, and why, and will disclosure assist in reducing them? And then very importantly, the links between gender wage gaps, women's economic empowerment and gender-based violence, and corporate leadership and transformation, and the role that that plays in addressing inequality. Business group Saka Liga has opposed the proposed Companies Amendment Bill, which it warns will harm the business landscape and ultimately push more skilled people to leave South Africa. The group added that the available pool of high-demand senior executives is quickly diminishing, meaning that when shareholders approach an executive, they know that the offer must be handsome due to the executive very likely having available opportunities abroad.
To some extent, the statement that you just read, the opposition to the bill is really an opposition to telling people what people earn. Our earnings inequality within those who have a job is the highest in the world, and our executive pay guys locate themselves in the top decile of the international earnings distribution. So there's a claim buried in here. When people say, okay, but our senior executives have to be paid well because they've got such a demanding job or whatever, well, paid well relative to what? Do they really think that they have to be at the top end of their particular category in the international earnings distribution? That's a hard argument to make, right? And obviously that sort of extreme inequality is a product of a very, very long history, and one needs to engage with that. The remuneration structures, the annual bargaining is really about change, is about increases. It never really deals with the actual distribution as it is. Our high inequality reflects an economy that's not really committed to doing the best that it can, to sharing the rewards of its productivity gains, for example. It's very hard to actually sustain the arguments that are made in that ahistorical way. And everybody, from the IMF to the World Economic Forum, have commented on the fact that our earning structure is odd and it's distorted. And it's distorted in a classic conservative economic sense. It's not like an earning structure that accords with efficient productivity enhancing operations.
Every single remuneration report that we read, they will say, we have assessed our executive remuneration, and as per the King Code recommendation, we consider that our executive remuneration is fair in the context of overall remuneration. But you don't get any other information about anyone else's pay.
So one of the things they say is that, well, 350 is not enough. We need either give someone a living wage but they don't complete the or what? Or just give them nothing at all. As who are on the field working with people who receive these grants, actually what you see is that the 350, though it's dinner for you and me, actually together at dinner, it's not enough. But what you see is that it allows people to print their CVs. You go to the internet cafe, you can apply for the job. Ideally, it's not enough, but what do people do in the meantime? I assure you, if you went in the most rural part of South Africa, and you offered a grant versus a job, the person would take the job. But now, because you haven't done that, you cannot leave them on their own, right? And this idea that we need to teach people to fish and not just hand it over. Okay, fine, I approve. Go teach them to fish. What are we doing here? Why aren't we teaching people to fish? You're not doing anyone a favor. It's a human right. It's a constitutional obligation. We don't have to beg. We don't have to plead, negotiating to get the president to the table. That is unacceptable. That is signs of a government that does not care for its people. You're not doing anyone a favor by handing over 350. In fact, what needs to happen is we need to go above a grant. There needs to be a bare minimum, what is referred to as a social protection floor. The bare minimum that someone, if they find themselves homeless today, there's bare minimum rights that they can access.
There are three things that have to happen. You have to rescue communities and industries that are in crisis. You have to stabilize, and you have to structurally transform. You've got to do things simultaneously. It's not like you can only do one thing at once. But some of them are short term, some of them are immediate, some of them are high impact, and some of them take a long time to roll out. So if you're telling people that they must wait for this economic reconstruction recovery plan to kick in and growth to kick in and jobs to kick in the context of massive technological change and in the context of the climate transition, etc., that's a cruel illusion, and it's a completely false binary that is being created.
At Black Sash, we did a piece of work around child nutrition and seeing how children eat, and when you get the ground, how much of it is just carbs, how much of it is, etc. And initially, we couldn't understand why people were so reluctant to speak to our researchers on the ground. Ultimately, then it came up that people were just embarrassed to admit that the children were not eating. People just felt a sense of shame to say that what I do as a mom is that I put a pot of boiling water and it boils until the kids fall asleep thinking that food is coming.
I want to bring it back more specifically to corporates, to the the skills retention argument. I would be interested to hear from a few more of you on that argument, because that is an incredibly compelling argument for most people, right? That if we don't maintain these levels of pay for senior executives, they're going to go to Australia. And then also just, of course, the other very strong argument in South Africa is that minimum wages are a problem, and from the point of view that they set the bar too high, as a result of which people who would otherwise have jobs don't have jobs, and we shouldn't have a minimum wage.
I think we need to say, what are the things that would keep people here? And I know CEOs who stay here who could possibly earn, I know many people who could earn a lot more elsewhere who stay here. But the other thing is, as long as we have this very concentrated economy with a few very big companies that are dominant, then you're going to have this problem even worse.
Yeah. I think it's important for us to foreground that this crisis that we're facing is not a South Africa unique crisis. First of all, the crisis of inequality globally is a crisis that is feminizing poverty, inequality, and unemployment across the world. And what is it doing to the upper echelons of those who have wealth and income is that that's becoming a very homogenous group of white men with concentrated wealth and power. In fact, with the current neoliberal dispensation and the rising levels of inequality, what we're seeing is that inequality consistently across the world results in poorer health outcomes, poorer education outcomes, poorer GBV outcomes. And who is paying the price? It's women of color. And I think that's part of the politicization of economics that we need to really grapple with. None of these decisions that are being taken are taken based on rationality. Homo economicus, that white guy who sets economic policy and determines supply and demand, is a fallacy. He's not relevant. He does not exist within this current world. And so to design our economic policy around that assumption of rationality, when we can see that it's harmful for the majority, is actually inefficient. The inefficiency is the death of Black women. So I can't stand for that, no matter what CEOs say.
Somebody mentioned that the national minimum, that the right wing likes to say that the minimum wage prevents people's right to work. I think it's important that the state set standards and that there should be a wage, which is the minimum wage. And the point is, in all this legislation and the Minimum Wage Commission, we sit and we overlook the exemption request. So it's not to say that you have to do this or nothing. You can argue for the fact that you can't afford to pay the minimum wage.
From an asset management point of view, we're happy to pay for performance, but, the difficulty is where this just becomes absolutely excessive and the numbers just become quite ridiculous. And what we're seeing in South Africa, particularly in the banking sector, is with 15 years service, a CEO can become a billionaire of a company they didn't found, simply treading water on market share. We see remuneration committees allowing this kind of pay to go through because they are being convinced that it is important and vitally important to retain these CEOs. The difficulty with that is what that reflects to asset managers is that there isn't a succession plan. The constant argument we're hearing is that these chaps will be poached and taken overseas, and that South African executives are in massive demand overseas. Well, there's no real evidence for that.
I would really like to ask particularly Masana and Rachel about the link between gender inequality, particularly obviously wage inequality, and gender-based violence.
This is directly linked to gender-based violence because we know that gender-based violence finds its motivation and its expression through gender inequality. First of all, the lack of recognition of social reproduction and unpaid care work is critical, and it has not been mentioned in this conversation. Furthermore, when we think about the ecosystem that drives gender-based violence and gender inequality in particular, what you see is that women typically are not being captured by the current macroeconomic policy and its ways in which it's designed. We exist in an ecosystem where there is a reliance on a male person to access some form of income and revenue within our context. Companies are implicit in the racialization and the feminization of the lower tiers of their employment structures. And this is where the policy is failing us, is we're focusing as if this is neat and tidy. Here's the regulation. Tell us how much people are earning. Tell us what you're doing around gender-based violence and sexual harassment, and expecting that that will be fundamentally transformative. But it is not transformative because it fails to address the structural drivers of gender inequality that persist.
So when I start by giving presentations and papers saying that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, people are like, yeah, so what's your next point?
Yeah.
That is significant and it's profound. And it means that our society is dysfunctional and it's not going to sustain itself. It's not going to survive. And the impact on each one of us, privileged, as well as, of course, people who are battling to survive every day, is absolute. We have a moment in which we can probably still engage with this. And the other point that I make is each year in which we don't engage with it, the need to reconstruct that space is greater. So in closing, I think that income needs to be in everybody's hands. I think that people need to have the ability to determine their livelihoods and their futures. I think the inequality is something which we need to be ashamed about, and we need to do something to bring that shame to bear.
Alternatives are not only possible and feasible, but necessary. The question is, how do we make those alternatives real? And I think South Africa's got enormous potential despite these incredible problems that we are confronting. And I think there are all sorts of ideas that now need to be concretized. You need a strategy to begin to engage, with the powers that be. So just to thank you, I think it's been a really interesting and useful session, but hopefully it's not going to end here.